Welcome to Woodlawn Cemetery in Guelph, Ontario, ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, Ojibwe, and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, we will be visiting Olympic champion and former world record holder Victor Davis, influential Canadian opera singer Edward Johnson, and the former Premier of Ontario, George Drew. Let's go. First up is Olympic champion and three-time world record holder Victor Davis, commemorated here at his family plot. A local boy, Davis started competitive swimming at the age of 12. By age 17, he had established himself on the national team circuit by winning a national title in his debut, cementing a dominance in the breaststroke. Known as a fierce competitor and for his brash and animated personality, Davis made his international debut in the 1982 World Aquatic Championships in Guayaquil, Ecuador, in the 200-meter breaststroke, where he broke a 6-year world record, winning gold in the process. And at the Commonwealth Games later that year in Brisbane, Australia, he would win gold again in the 200-meter breaststroke. But his Commonwealth Games was overshadowed by controversy. On day 2 of the Games, Canada was disqualified in the 4x100 meter medley relay for a false start. The next day, in the 4x200 meter medley relay, which Davis would participate, Queen Elizabeth II was in the stands to spectate and later present the medals. Canada finished first, and during the celebrations, officials disqualified Canada again for a false start. And in the frustration, Davis kicked over a deck chair. The incident caused an uproar due to it being in the presence of Her Majesty. That's the narrative, but apparently in fact the Queen had already left the stands to prepare for the medal presentation and did not witness the event. But people took the story and ran with it. Regardless, the incident cemented Davis as a fiery competitor, ecstatic in victory, livid in defeat. In the lead up to the 1984 LA Olympics, during the Team Canada Olympic trials, Davis once again broke his world record in the 200-meter breaststroke that he had set 2 years prior, and his performance qualified him for his first Olympics. Despite being down with mononucleosis for 9 months in 1983, Davis's first Olympics started strong, winning a silver medal in the 100-meter breaststroke. 3 days later, Davis would compete in his signature event, the 200-meter breaststroke. Coming in as the world record holder, Davis would win gold, and in the process, once again broke his own world record with a time of 2 minutes 13:34. He would close out the games winning a silver medal with his teammates in the 4x100 meter medley relay. In recognition of his world record-setting Olympic performance, Davis was invested as a member of the Order of Canada. In the intervening Olympic years, Davis participated in the 1986 Commonwealth Games in Edinburgh, Scotland, winning 2 golds and a silver. In an almost redemptive moment, Davis was tossing frisbees into the stands before one of the medal ceremonies, and passing by the Queen's box, he handed her one personally, which she graciously accepted. Further on, he participated in the 1986 World Aquatic Championships in Madrid, Spain, and won a gold and a silver. Davis was unstoppable heading into the 1988 Olympics. The 1988 Olympics were held in Seoul, South Korea. His first event was the 100-meter breaststroke, which Davis entered as the reigning silver medalist. Hoping to improve from his previous result, the race ended in disappointment when Davis would miss the podium entirely by 18/10 of a second, with a 4th place finish. Better news came when Davis and his teammates would repeat as silver medalists in the 4x100 meter medley relay. And with that medal, Davis's 4th career Olympic medal, he became the most decorated swimmer in Canadian Olympic history, a title he would hold until the 2020 Olympics to Penny Oleksiak. Davis would retire from competitive swimming a year later in July 1989 with a total of 16 competitive swimming medals. Sadly, mere months into retirement, Davis was standing outside a nightclub in Montreal, Quebec, when he was struck by a vehicle who then fled the scene. Suffering from hemorrhaging and major skull damage, Davis succumbed to his injuries 2 days later. and passed away at the age of 25. The driver, who claimed he was trying to avoid Davis throwing something at his vehicle, even though it was determined that Davis wasn't even facing his car when he was struck, was sentenced to 10 months in prison, but he only served 4. Digging further, I discovered the driver would serve time again in 2017 after pleading guilty to pushing down a 70-year-old man down a flight of stairs after a scuffle in a bar, which resulted in his death. The driver would serve 15 months in prison. In response to the second incident, he said, quote, "He was the victim of bad luck." Davis was posthumously inducted into the International Swimming Hall of Fame in 1994. His legacy lives on with the Victor Davis Memorial Fund, granted each year to promising Canadian competitive swimmers to assist in their training and education, with many past recipients earning medals at the Olympics. After the 1990 Commonwealth Games in Auckland, per his family's request, Davis's remains were scattered off the coast of New Zealand by his former teammates. Going from the sports world to the music world now, here we are at the grave of Edward Johnson. Johnson began singing at his local church choir as a boy here in Guelph. A tenor, Johnson emerged as a promising amateur soloist, and at a concert in Stratford, Ontario, he met the famous Canadian contralto Edith Jane Miller, who encouraged him to move to New York City to try going pro. Johnson took Miller's advice and moved to New York City soon after, at the age of 20. While in New York, Johnson would receive professional tutelage and perform in various orchestras across the northern United States, establishing his voice as, quote, "unusually strong, but remarkably sweet." And he would go on to make his Carnegie Hall debut in 1904. But Johnson's big break came 3 years later, when he had the leading role in the North American premiere of Oscar Strauss's famous work, A Waltz Dream. The opera premiered in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, before moving to New York City's Broadway Theater. Johnson stayed in the role of Lieutenant Nicky for its entire 16-week run. It was now 1908, and Johnson was now a star. Now with the means to go overseas, Johnson moved to Paris, France later that year to train with some of the biggest opera stars in Europe. He found himself in London, England in 1909, where he met and married his wife, Beatrice d'Arniero, the daughter of a Portuguese viscount. But he decided to make it to the biggest stages in opera and moved to Italy, where their daughter was born in 1910, and named her Fiorenza, after her birthplace of Florence. Johnson adopted the stage name Edoardo di Giovanni, the Italianization of his name, and performed in major productions across Italy, including at Milan's La Scala Opera House for 5 seasons. Sadly, Beatrice passed away in 1919 in Florence, Italy. Heartbroken, Johnson decided to leave Italy and Edoardo di Giovanni behind and returned to North America with 9-year-old Fiorenza. Johnson never remarried, and he would still credit Beatrice for his successes later in life. Johnson made his North American opera debut 3 months later in Chicago, where he would remain with the Chicago Opera for the next 3 years. But in 1922, he returned to New York City to join the iconic Metropolitan Opera. With the Met Opera, Johnson became one of its most prolific stars and biggest names in New York City. With his performance tenure lasting 13 years with the Met Opera, he closed the curtain on his singing career with one final performance on March 20th, 1935. In recognition of his career, Johnson was made Commander of the Order of the British Empire by King George V at a ceremony in Buckingham Palace on June 29th, 1935. While doing some research, I was able to find some of Johnson's recordings online, including one of O Canada from 1928, 11 years before it became a popular Canadian anthem, and 52 years before it became the official Canadian anthem. Most interestingly, it contains the omitted and forgotten second stanza.
O Canada, where pines and maples grow, great prairies spread and lordly
However, Johnson's time away from the Met Opera wouldn't last for long. With the unexpected passing of its general manager just 6 weeks into the job, Johnson took up the management mantle in May 1935 in the midst of the Great Depression. The Depression made it difficult for the Met Opera to stay afloat, and Johnson decided to try new ways to attract audiences like radio broadcasts. Then, with the outbreak of the Second World War, the Met Opera was restricted from bringing in talent from Europe. So instead, Johnson decided to foster homegrown American talent, which began a new wave of American opera stars. Johnson's time as general manager ended in 1950, seeing the Met Opera through the Depression, the war, and the post-war years, and decided to fully retire from the opera scene after a 42-year career, 28 of them spent with the Met Opera. Johnson decided to return home afterwards to Guelph, Ontario. Throughout his career, Johnson kept close ties to home, and with an interest in developing musical education in Canada, he was chairman of the board for the Royal Conservatory of Music in Toronto and on the board of governors for the University of Toronto, where he helped establish their faculty of music. Here in Guelph, he established the Edward Johnson Music Foundation, which brought musical education to school children until 2011. While attending a performance by the National Ballet of Canada in 1959, Johnson suffered a heart attack and passed away that evening at the age of 80. In recognition of his contributions and talent, he was designated a Person of National Historic Significance by the federal government in 1974 and bears the name of the main building of the University of Toronto's Faculty of Music, which he helped establish, which also houses his collection of memorabilia, including letters, albums, photographs, and his awards. Coincidentally, Johnson and Beatrice's daughter, Fiorenza, married the next figure we will be visiting, and her gravestone is inscribed with the same poem as her parents. Underneath the flag of Ontario is Johnson's daughter, Fiorenza, who rests here next to her husband, George Drew, the 14th Premier of Ontario. Born and raised here in Guelph, George Alexander Drew was a law student before serving as an artillery officer in the First World War. Afterwards, he was called to the bar in 1920 and practiced law here in Guelph. But Drew was drawn to public life and was elected mayor of Guelph in 1925. His career in politics would continue at the provincial level when he ran for leadership of Ontario's Progressive Conservative Party, or PC Party, in 1936, but lost to Earl Rowe. He and Rowe would fail to win their seat in the 1937 election, with the PC Party losing to Premier Mitch Hepburn's Ontario Liberal Party. And during this time, he married Fiorenza Johnson, who played an influential role in his political career. With Rowe's resignation, Drew once again ran for leadership of the party and was this time successful and won a seat in the Legislative Assembly in 1939 in a by-election in the now defunct riding of Simcoe East. In the next provincial election in 1943, he and the PCs were successful and formed a minority government, making Drew the 14th Premier of Ontario. Drew started what is known in Ontario as the PC dynasty, where the PC party would form the Ontario government for the next 42 years, an incredible streak that saw them win re-election until being ousted in 1985. Drew would only serve as premier of 5 of those 42 years. Despite the PCs winning re-election, Drew failed to win his own seat in the Toronto riding of High Park in the 1948 election. Being succeeded as premier by T.L. Kennedy, Drew entered federal politics by pursuing and then winning the leadership of the federal Progressive Conservative Party of Canada. However, Drew and the federal PCs failed to oust the incumbent Liberal Party of Canada government under Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent in the 1949 and 53 federal elections. Drew would resign as leader in 1958, citing poor health, and was succeeded by John Diefenbaker, who a year later would defeat Prime Minister Saint Laurent to become Prime Minister himself. Under Prime Minister Diefenbaker, Drew was appointed the Canadian High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, a post he would keep until 1964, even after Prime Minister Diefenbaker was defeated by the Liberal Party Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson. After his posting in London, Drew moved back to Guelph and was made the first Chancellor of the newly established University of Guelph in 1965. 2 years later, he was made Companion of the newly created Order of Canada in 1967, Canada's centennial year. Drew passed away in 1973 at the age of 78 and was buried here next to Fiorenza, who passed away in 1965 at the age of 55. Three-time world record holder and Olympic champion Victor Davis, Canadian opera star Edward Johnson, and former Mayor of Guelph, Premier of Ontario, and Canadian High Commissioner to the UK, George Drew. All here at Woodlawn Cemetery in Guelph, Ontario. Thanks for watching.
Thank you. If you enjoyed the video, I would greatly appreciate if you would consider liking and subscribing to help support and grow the channel. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.